wee lad called Jack, and he lived with his mother in the forest in Scotland, and they worked for a laird. Now, laird is just a Scottish word for a lord, so the landowner, right? Now, the thing is, laird was the meanest man in the whole of Scotland, and he lived in a castle, and down in the dungeons of his castle, he had hoards of treasure. And he had even more than he should have had, because he never paid the people the money that they were due for all the work that they did for him, tending his animals, looking after sheep and shearing the wool and all that kind of stuff, all the usual stuff if you lived in a country estate. And every time they would go for their wages, he would say, "You're all asking for far too much, I'm not giving you that. How can I be the richest man in the whole of Scotland if I give you all that money?" So he kept the people poor, oppressed, with poor houses, with fences falling down and roofs caving in and chimneys falling apart. So they lived in the meanest of ways. So they all had to be very, very clever at making extra ways to make a living. And Jack's mother, what she used to do was in the springtime, so round about kind of now a little bit later into the summer, when all the sheep's wool was heavy on their backs and the sheep would kind of just feel the itch of a winter's fleece just being too hot now, and they would rub their backs against the fences and clumps of wool would fall off. And what Jack's mother would do was go along and gather all these clumps of wool. She'd wash it, of course, get all the beasties out, get all the muck out, and then she would dye it and she would spin it, and then she would knit with it. And she knitted all kinds of garments, so scarves, gloves, hats, whatever, take it to market, and that was her way of getting in a wee bit of extra money. So when Jack was in the house, he was always tripping over clumps of wool and bits of knitting and rolled up balls and all this whatever, but he loved all the work that his mother did, and they were very happy. There was no school for the children to go to in those days, but there was the education of the land, the education of nature. And one thing that Jack loved to do was to walk through the forest. And when he walked through the forest, he would hear the birds singing. But it wasn't just the singing he heard. He actually understood every single thing the birds were saying to each other. And Jack got his education through the birds. Because when it was springtime and the birds had all come back from their winter migrations, they would tell him about the countries they'd flown over and the things that they'd seen and the different coloured skins of people and the way they did things. And Jack would learn so much. Now you need to pretend now it's midsummer. I know it's a few months away yet, and so the story's a wee bit out of context, but imagine it's midsummer, the longest day of light of the year. Jack is walking through the forest and the birds are making such an almighty noise. And Jack says, "Birds, birds, what's going on?" And he said, "Well, Jack, it's midsummer, it's midsummer." He said, "I know, my mum just told me that. But really, what's so particular about this midsummer?" "Ah, well," said the birds, "you must listen to this now, Jack. Every 50 years, on Midsummer's Day, all the trees lift themselves up by their roots and they go down to the stream and have a long drink because they're very, very thirsty. And then after that, they stand in a circle in the field and they wait for Old Crovey, the old oak tree. She's hundreds of years old. She's the queen of this forest. And Old Crovey will stand in the middle of the circle and the trees will all dance round about her. You can watch if you want, Jack." "Can I really?" said Jack. "Oh yes," said the birds. "Now we must tell you something to be warned about. In the hollows in the ground, where all the trees sit with their roots, are all the treasures of the earth. Gold and silver and rubies and emeralds and sapphires, all the treasures of the earth. And the trees will allow you to take 2 or 3 jewels. And even if you take that, it's more than you need for your own life. You'll be rich forever. But if you take more than 2 or 3 jewels, then the trees and the earth will punish you for your greed." "Oh," said Jack, "oh, just imagine if I took 2 or 3 jewels and how happy that would make my mother. That would be more than enough for us if you're saying it would keep us wealthy for our lifetime. That's all we need." So Jack went home, told his mother what the birds had said, and she said, "You know this, Jack? When I was a little girl, my granny used to tell me stories when I was going to bed. And she told me about the trees dancing, and I thought it was just a nice wee story to make me have nice dreams and to sleep comfortably. But if I think back on that, 50 years ago my granny would have been a younger girl and she would have known about it. And I know times were a wee bit better in my family then, so maybe she got 2 or 3 jewels from the birds. Wouldn't it be amazing if it was true?" So she gave Jack a fine hearty supper that evening, and as the sun was going down, she sent him on his way. And just as he was leaving the cottage, she put her hand deep into her knitting basket and she said, "Jack, take this with you." And she handed him a bundle of knitting and she said, "You might need this." Now Jack looked at the bundle of knitting in his hands and he thought, what on earth does my mum want me to take knitting with me? Now Jack could knit, but he had no plans that night to knit. But he looked at his mother and her eyes were really imploring him to take what she was offering. So because he loved his mother and he really trusted her and he didn't want to be disrespectful, he said, "Thanks, Mum," and he put it in his pocket. And off he went, and as soon as he got to the forest, as the sun was going down and the stars were beginning to come up and the moon was shining quite nicely, he noticed the incredible silence. Because even at night he would have heard the birds chatting about what they'd done all day and how they were going to sleep and different things, but there wasn't a single sound of a bird to be heard. He couldn't work out why, and then he thought, of course they can't sleep in the trees tonight because the trees are all going to be dancing. They must have gone somewhere else. So Jack found a fine big stone to lean down, to sit against and to sit back a long enough distance from the forest so that he gave the trees room to move. And he waited in the silence. And then he began to hear music. It was as though somebody was playing pipes and whistles and drums and ringing bells, and he looked around wondering if folk from the different parts of the estate were coming to also witness the same event. But then there was nobody there. And Jack thought, what's all this? And then as he really tuned in his ear to the sounds, he felt the vibration coming up from the ground, up through the roots of the trees, up the very trunks of them, along their branches. And then he could see the branches beginning to sway as though the trees were all loosening themselves up in the ground. And Jack thought, wow, the music is coming from the earth itself. Isn't this incredible? And right in front of his eyes, a tiny little rowan sapling, maybe a few years old, just this big, pulled its little roots out of the ground, shook some soil off, and then it ran down to the stream, jumped in and had a little drink. Then it climbed carefully out of the bank of the stream and stood and took its place in the field. Then one by one, each of the trees in order, as if they knew which one was next, from the youngest to the oldest, from the thinnest to the fattest. Each tree pulled its roots so carefully so as not to break or crack, and walked sedately down to the stream, put its roots in, drank, and then climbed out and stood in its place in the circle, until finally at the back of the forest the only tree remaining was Old Crovey, the oldest tree, the old oak tree, the queen of the forest. And Old Crovey pulled her long, long roots from out of the ground. She pulled them tenderly and carefully because she was hundreds of years old, and she walked down to the stream. And when she placed her roots in the ground, into the water, well, she covered the stream from bank to bank, and she drank and drank and drank and drank, and Jack wondered if she was going to drink the stream dry. Then at last she'd sated her thirst, and she stood in the circle. And all the trees used their branches as we would use our arms, and they used their roots as we would use our legs, and they bowed to her and they began to jig and they began to dance, and they danced around her, and they had the greatest ceilidh dance of the last 50 years. Well, Jack completely forgot all about the treasure.